How we doing, Cedarbrook? Oh, we'll get there. We'll get there. Hey, my name is James Brown. I'm one of the pastors at this place, and if you are new with us or you're part of the baptism and dedication today, family member, friend, sponsor, so glad you are with us today. I'm excited particularly because we are in the third week, the final week of a teaching series that we have called Home Team Advantage. And I believe that the topic that we're going to talk about today can transform your family and the way that you experience your family as well. So we're going to get there eventually, but real quick, I just want to invite all of you, if you haven't already, go ahead and pull out your mobile phone. I mean, nobody's ever said that in a sermon before. Go ahead and pull out your cell phone, and I want you to go in the next few minutes to the site that we mentioned earlier, cedarbrook.info, because that site is not only the place where we sign up for groups, it's also the place where we are able to access notes for the messages as well. So if you click notes, it'll take you to specific notes for this sermon, for the topic that we're going to be talking about today. And then there's also one more link on that page that I want you to know about, and it has the word Genesis describing it. We are starting in 2 weeks a brand new teaching series called Origin Stories, where we're going to go through the book of Genesis to about chapter 8 or 9 to look at how things came to be. And part of that series, there's a little pre-work for it. So when you click on Genesis, there's 2 videos that are there that will get you ready for that series in 2 weeks, as well as a study guide that has all the questions to look at as we're going through the series together. In addition to that, in 2 weeks, everyone is going to get a copy of this booklet that is the book of Genesis as well, and we'll be reading that together as a church. But in 2 weeks, you're going to get it. Anybody here a reader? Anybody? Okay, no readers over here. Anybody? You guys read it all? No? Yeah, you do read? Okay, let me give you a pre-release copy. You're the only one other than the last service that has a copy of that devotional. And so that, in 2 weeks, we're going to launch that together, but I wanted to make you aware as you prepare for that time. So that's in 2 weeks. This week, we want to wrap up this series. And this series, Home Team Advantage, is about family. And at Cedarbrook, family is incredibly important. In fact, you may or may not know this about this church, but this church has a strategic objective to resource and support families. And right now, we are beginning the process of fleshing that strategy out to help CB families figure out what it means for families here to be firing on all cylinders. We want moms, we want dads, we want kids and grandparents, aunts and uncles, and influential adults in kids' lives. We want all these people to discover how to find their place on the team and begin playing their positions so that we can indeed have a home team advantage when it comes to families. Now, the challenge in attempting to resource and support families at large is that every family experience is so incredibly different. I mean, just think about it. For example, if I grabbed one of those mics, put it up here, and invited everybody to come through and talk about their family situation, that would be amazing. That would be awesome, hilarious. I mean, to the parade of dumpster fires, potentially, that we could hear about, right? Or the success stories, right? But the point is, it's all incredibly different. Your family and my family and your family, they all look different. As varied as those things may be, the hardest part of the process is number one, trying to figure out how do we bring families together when it's so different. But the other part that's really complicated, really challenging, really confusing, is that as we try to find what God's snapshot for families might be, what his picture-perfect family looks like, there's really not one. There's not one. You don't believe me? In fact, go to the Bible, for example, and you could open it up and read the whole thing. And what you will find is rarity when it comes to ideals and fully functioning family pictures. They're just not there. There really isn't one. There isn't a good one. I mean, honestly, if you're trying to find an ideal family in the Bible, we should at least be able to look at one family that should have gotten everything right. It's the family that we admire and lift up and celebrate every single Christmas season. That holy family of Mary and Joseph and Jesus. That should at least provide us with some sort of picture-perfect, ideal family according to God. But if you look at the Gospel of Luke, for example, there's this one time that Mary and Joe actually left Jesus in Jerusalem by himself when he was 12 years old. They forgot Jesus in Jerusalem. Joe, have you seen Jesus? No, I thought he was with you. No, I told you to get him. And then a fight breaks out, right? Yeah, after that. Yeah, the little "we lost Jesus" situation kind of knocked them out of the running for first century Parents of the Year, right? I mean, that's the Holy Family, but quite honestly, our very first parents, Adam and Eve, they didn't do much better, right? Following the whole forbidden fruit scenario, the first recorded homicide in history was when Adam and Eve's son, Cain, killed his brother, Abel. And it just went downhill from there. That's where it started. Now, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is full of family stories, but these family stories, they give us really good lessons from really bad examples, which I think forces us to ask the question, with no good biblical examples of family for us to model our own families after, what is our ideal family supposed to even look like according to God? In other words, how do we know what target we're trying to hit? How do we know when someone crosses home plate and we can put a run on the scoreboard when it comes to family from God's perspective? Well, the good news is that although there are not a lot of good examples of families in the Bible is actually full of really good examples for families. In fact, on the message notes on cedarbrook.info, I've listed a number of passages that sort of begin to paint this picture of what God thinks about when he thinks about family. And at Cedarbrook, these verses that I listed in the notes, as well as other family-focused verses, they paint the whole picture of what God expects, what he's thinking about when he's wanting us to have an ideal family. And these verses are so important to us because what underscores this idea of resourcing and supporting families is the belief that we value God's ideal idea for the family. That we value that. God's ideal idea for the family. We want to look at what he said about family, and we want to strive for that. Now, let me just set that statement in a place that it can sink in to your mind just for a second. Think about that statement. Think about what I just said. That we value God's ideal idea for the family. Think about it. Just let it sink in. Let it sink in. Whew. If it hasn't already happened yet, if you're thinking about that statement correctly, you should begin to feel some tension around it. You should feel some tension about it. Because have you achieved it? What happens when you don't? When your marriage doesn't match God's ideal, when the way that you raise your kids doesn't match God's ideal, when what's happened and what you've done and created doesn't match God's ideal, what does that mean to him? I hope you feel that tension. I hope you feel it. And believe it or not, that tension is going to be the context for everything that we talk about in the rest of this sermon. Because according to the Bible, in every family situation, there's a very important dynamic that is at play. And the dynamic plays out like this, that there's the ideal, that there is God's desire and God's design, his dream for family. There is this ideal that exists. And at the exact same time, there's the real. There's what we've done to it, where we have made decisions, where we have fallen short of it. There's the ideal, and then there's reality, and then in the middle of that, in between, there's a tension. There's a tension that exists that we have not pleased God in the process, that tension that we fell short. And then there's an even bigger tension that we have to deal with. I mean, how do you make that statement, we value God's ideal idea of family, when no one in the history of the world has ever had one? Not even Jesus' own family could pull it off. How do you hold those two in tension? Well, before you check out or before you leave, okay, that's fine. You don't need to leave unless you're holding a baby. It's like stay here, and hang with me a little bit, because I think you need to know that something is unique about this challenge. And what's unique is that to Jesus, it's not unique, is that he set up these sort of scenarios, these sort of tension points all the time. In fact, Jesus was constantly pointing people to and teaching toward an ideal that he knew people would never achieve. I mean, think about some of the stuff that he taught. I mean, the Old Testament, the Big Ten, the 10 Commandments say, don't murder. And then Jesus comes along and he says, if you hate someone, you're committing murder in your heart. How's that for an ideal? Am I doing okay with that one? Crushing it? Old Testament, Big Ten says, do not commit adultery. Jesus comes along and says, if you lust, you are committing adultery in your heart. Doing okay with that one? He says, let your yes be yes and your no, no, never maybe. How about this one? How about this ideal? Love your enemies. That works in our world, right? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Or this one, this ideal. If someone hits you, turn the other cheek. Or this ideal. Don't worry. Jesus says, don't worry. Which no one can reach, right? In fact, some of you worry when you don't worry. Because there's like, what am I supposed to be worried about something, right? It's impossible. He says, don't judge. Forgive people whenever they ask for it. Do to others whatever you would like them to do to you. And then this is the ideal of all ideals. This is the big one. Try hitting this one. Jesus said, but you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. You think you have earthly father-daddy issues, right? Try these divine daddy issues. Try those on for size. Right? There's these ideals that he throws out there that he knows that we will never achieve. And just so you know, I pulled these examples out of 3 chapters in one of the biographies of Jesus called the Gospel of Matthew. So I say, anybody here see this list? Nailing it? Anybody nailing it? Getting them all? Anybody? Anybody getting these ideals exactly right every single time, all the time? Of course not. Of course not. That was never the point. But this kind of thing, this kind of scenario of the ideal and the real and the tension is something that Jesus set up all the time. He was continually teaching about and pointing people to God's ideal in some area of life. And as you look at those, I mean, if you want to be really honest, if you're a Jesus follower, when you look at these ideals that I just read, just some of them, from time to time, if you're trying to follow them, you're going to feel a little bit of tension around them. You're going to feel a little bit uncomfortable that you're not hitting them like you'd hoped, that your current condition, the real reality, doesn't quite line up against God's ideal idea. And so you live with this sort of tension, this tension in between. And so the question then becomes, when we don't reach that ideal, when we don't hit it, what does Jesus do about it? What does he do about it? Well, the answer is nothing. No, what? Nothing? James, that's not the answer. No, that's the answer. See, Jesus constantly pointed people to an ideal, but yet he refused to condemn those who fell short of it. He was constantly pointing people and teaching toward an ideal idea, but he was never, ever condemning or criticizing those who fell short of it. So when you don't reach that ideal that you were striving for, God's ideal idea, and you don't hit it, he doesn't hate you. He's not even mad at you. And what's amazing is that you see this balancing act play out in almost every interaction that Jesus has in the gospel stories. Actually, I think the most profound illustration of this dynamic shows us how Jesus really understood family relationships, especially when they hit their failure point. And I want to show it to you today. So if you have a Bible with you or have a Bible app, I want to invite you to go with me to Matthew chapter 19. If you don't have one, don't worry, we'll put it on the screen so you can follow along. But what you're going to see in the next few moments in this passage is this reality, that Jesus is completely comfortable with the tension that exists between the ideal and the real. That he is completely comfortable with living in that tension. And I think for those of us who are followers of Jesus, we have to figure out how to, in some way, learn to live in this tension as well. And so here's how it played out. Matthew 19, verse 3 says this. Some Pharisees came and tried to trap Jesus with this question. Now, in other words, what's happening here is these guys are traveling around, tracking Jesus down, asking him questions, not because they're curious or they're wanting to learn, but rather they're trying to set up a scenario where they can catch him and they can discredit him in front of the crowds. And so here's the question. Here's the test that they're putting before him. Here's the question. Should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? Now, we don't have time to dig into the divorce topic in the day of Jesus, but let's just say that the law at this time allowed men out of a marriage for almost any circumstance, even as simple as burning dinner, you could get out, okay? While the women were stuck no matter what, okay? And so they've set this question up for Jesus. And so Jesus responds in verse 4. He says this, look at this. He says, haven't you read the scriptures? Now, I love this because these men most likely had memorized the entirety of the Old Testament. Their Hebrew Bible, like 3/4 of the Bible that you would have, they had it memorized. They had it in their heart. So what Jesus is saying, haven't you read the scriptures? Complete insult. He's throwing some serious shade their way. I love it. But then Jesus' next few words are the most important part of the statement because it relates directly to our discussion. He says, haven't you read the scriptures? For they record from the what? From the beginning, God made them male and female. You see, what Jesus is beginning to do is make an argument for God's ideal idea when it comes to marriage. And this statement that he's quoting here, actually, if you follow along in a few weeks when you get your Genesis reading booklet, you're going to read this very statement on day one because it is on the first page of the first book of the Bible. Jesus makes this statement. He quotes this. God made them male and female. And then he moves on a little bit more. He says, verse 5, this explains why man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Now, in the reading, that little booklet, you're going to encounter this one on day 2. Like he's going back to the very beginning. When he says in the beginning, this is what God was imagining, that's what he's quoting from. He's quoting from literally page 1 of the Bible and page 2 of the Bible. And in verse 6, he draws this conclusion. He says, since they are no longer two, but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. And so Jesus is drawing this conclusion about God's idea for marriage from the very beginning, that when two people get married, they're no longer two people, but they're one people. And when God has put those people together, nobody should ever separate them. Now, he's bringing up the ideal. The Pharisees don't like this. They said, verse 7, well, then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? They're like, I don't know if we like this scenario, Jesus. Like, there's no eject button. What are you talking about here? And then in verse 8, he lays it out. He lays out this ideal, real connection. Look at this, so amazing. Jesus replied, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God had originally intended. This is incredible. He holds them in tension. Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts. That's reality. That's life, how it plays out. But at the exact same time, that was not how God intended it to be. That's the ideal. The two become one. You see, in verse 8, Jesus is saying, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me take you back to where things were perfect. Let me take you back to God's ideal idea, back when things were the way God wanted them to be. But Jesus is also saying, I understand at the exact same time that sometimes things don't work out. I understand that people do get divorced. I understand that things will happen. Sometimes it's inevitable, and we need a safe way to facilitate it. I understand that sometimes divorce is a reality. But at the exact same time, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that in the beginning, divorce wasn't the plan. In the beginning, God created it in such a way that two people become one, and you can't unone what God has made one. But at the exact same time, I know things happen. And relationships fall apart. But I don't want to let go of original design either. You see this tension. Jesus is saying there's an ideal and there's a real, and I am comfortable bringing both of these to you to hold in tension. I'm comfortable with it, the ideal and the real, and I want you to be comfortable with it as well. You see, I want to bring this up because I want us to consider it very carefully, this reality, because for many of us, including myself, our tendency when we enter into this real ideal scenario is to redefine reality. When we don't achieve the mark or hit the target, what we do is we adjust the ideal, or we change the rules, or we change the terms, or we reset expectations, or we redefine family. We do that in order to feel better about where we are. And that's the easy way to go. It's much harder and much less common for us to do instead, to embrace a standard that many of us have or will eventually fall short of. You see, the essence of this tension is this: am I willing to embrace an ideal that may never be a reality in my current family? Am I willing to embrace that ideal, or will I choose to ignore the ideal in order to feel better about where I am or where my family actually is? That's the issue, the essence of the tension. And let's be honest here, the truth is, many of us have settled for less than God's ideal idea for family. We've settled for less. We've redefined things so that we don't feel bad about not hitting it. And if that's the case, if you've settled, I just want to challenge you. I want to invite you to maybe do a couple of things to move in that direction again. And the first one is this. Maybe what you need to do if you've settled is to raise the bar. Raise the bar. Now, as I was thinking about this point, it reminded me of when I was a freshman in high school. When I was a freshman in high school, I signed up for this torture sport called cross country. Cross country. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's made by the devil. It's the worst sport ever invented. Essentially, they're like, hey, go put on some underwear and run around in sleet and snow. It's just, why would you do that? That's a terrible idea. So anyway, I signed up for it, and I wasn't very good, clearly, at it. You can tell by my attitude toward it. So I wasn't very good at it. I was adequate. I would not finish first, but I wouldn't finish last either. I'd finish right in the middle almost every single time. And so my coach pulled me aside after a few races, and he said, you know what, Jamie, I can help you. Here's what I want you to do. I want you, as you approach the finish line, I want you to actually run past the finish line. Like, imagine that there's a finish line maybe 10 feet, 10 steps past the real finish line, beyond the finish line. I want you to run to that finish line as hard as you can at the end of every race. And I'm like, okay, I'll give it a shot. I'll give it a shot. And guess what? I did it, and my time improved. Why? Well, because the natural tendency when we're finishing a race, when we're getting to what we think is the finish line, we sort of slow down and let our momentum and our inertia carry us to the outcome. But what God is saying is that I want you to shoot beyond the finish line. I want you to shoot beyond what you think is possible. I want you to shoot beyond your own reality, beyond your reality to my ideal. And in doing so, that will carry you to better. Doing that will allow you to improve and do more than you ever thought possible. And so if you have settled when it comes to your marriage, or when it comes to your kids or your family relationships, I want to encourage you to raise the bar, to shoot beyond the finish line, to do more, run past, run through, and see what God can do with that direction, with that intensity. Number one, raise the bar. Number two, renounce your comfort. Renounce your comfort. And what I mean by that is be willing to live in the tension. Most of us hate tension. I love tension because I can get that gene. I love awkward situations. Sometimes I create them. It's just how I am. I like tension, but most people don't. They hate it. They'll do anything instead of dealing with it. And I want to say to you, live in it. Embrace it. You see, whatever your family looks like right now, if you're doing family right, if you're doing family God's way, it will create tension. It will create tension between the real and the ideal. But here's the deal. Here's what I know. For Jesus, as the bar gets higher, as the standard gets harder, his grace gets deeper. And the forgiveness that he offers becomes richer. You see, whatever this looks like for you, whatever family has been for you in the past or it is in the present for all of us, if you are striving for the ideal idea of family, there's grace when you fall short. And for all of us, there's forgiveness. In fact, right now in this moment, there's the possibility of a brand new start wherever you find yourself at today. So I want to say to you, don't give up. Don't give up on God's ideal idea for family. Honor it, value it, strive for it, raise the bar, renounce your comfort, and then most importantly, invite God into the middle of that tension. Because the good news is that he wants to partner with you in making his dream for family a reality in your life. He has uniquely designed family relationships to set the stage for success in every other area of our existence. So that when we win at family, we win at life. So the bottom line is we need God. We need God in our families. We need him like we did today, in dedicating the next generation to him, but we also need him in an ongoing basis through prayer and priorities and practice. And when he is present, his presence in the middle of that tension is the very thing that gives us our home team advantage. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for this moment, and we stand in awe of the fact that you designed this thing called family. And as different and strange and exciting and heartbreaking as it is, God, you have designed an ideal idea that you call us to strive to, that you call us to move toward. And so many times we've settled for less than your best. And God, we're sorry for that. Forgive us, give us grace when we fall short. But God, help us to value that in our daily lives so that we can run past, we can raise the bar and become more than we ever thought possible. And so, God, as we live in that tension, we ask that you be there with us. We need you. We need you more than we know. And God, we thank you most of all for Jesus. And it's in his name we pray. And all God's people said, amen.